The left is always inclined to look on the grim side of things. Always inclined to look on the grim side of things. The cup is always half empty. Until you point out, look, it's half full. It doesn't look so bad.
Welcome to Political Gingervitis, the crazy and zany podcast for progressives who need a laugh. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Andrew Stewart, and this week we're going to try to put a smile on your face and maybe a few thoughts in your head.
A woman reporter wanted to know the history of his moustache. How did it become his trademark?
I'll tell you what happened. I had worn this mustache early in vaudeville. And we had played the Palace, and the following week we were playing the Fifth Avenue Theater on 29th Street. And at the Palace we did 2 shows a day, and here we did 4. And since our act ran an hour, I was on the stage about 4 hours a day. So we would give a show around 2 o'clock, and then give one at 5, and then you gave one at 8. So if we went on at 5, we were through at 6, and then we'd have to eat pretty quickly in order to get back for the next show. And I got back, we were fooling around the restaurant or something, I got back for the next show just as our curtain music was being played, and I didn't have time to paste on a mustache, which I was doing then, so there was some black grease paint there, and I just took it and went like that. And I noticed that the laughs were in the same place. What wasn't funny didn't get a laugh. What was funny got the same laugh. So I said, what the hell am I gluing that thing on every show? So then when we started to do the first picture, which was Coconuts, Walter Wanger, I think, was the head of Paramount then. And he says, of course, you're going to use a real mustache. And I said, why? He says, well, in a movie, nobody walks around with a painted mustache. Everybody has a real mustache or they glue one on. I says, well, I don't think that makes much sense either. Our pictures didn't make much sense, and I don't see why I have to have a glued mustache now when I could paint one on. He says, well, the audience won't believe you're real. Oh, I forgot to tell you. Down at the Fifth Avenue Theater, when I did this, when I come off the stage, the manager said, you played the Palace last week, and you glued on a mustache, and we're paying you the same money they paid you. And he said, I want the same mustache. So we told him to get the hell out of the room, and that was the end of the day. He didn't bother us anymore.
Welcome again, folks, to another episode of Political Gingervitis. I'm your host, Andrew Stewart. And today we're going to jump right into things. We have 2 very important guests for you today. First, we're going to hear from Jeffrey St. Clair, the wonderful editor at Counterpunch, talking about his fantastically funny book, Bernie and the Sandernistas, Field Notes from a Failed Revolution. And then we're also going to have a conversation with Dr. John Geyman. He is the physician and retired instructor from medical schools who has been working tirelessly over the last several years advocating for single-payer health care and why the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, was so problematic from the outset. But first, we are going to have a talk on the time tuner yet again. So let me just turn on my time tuner and get the thing adjusted. Okay, so, hello Andrew in the future.
Hello Andrew in the past.
What are we able to say about Donald Trump as president? Because he campaigned on an anti-war détente policy towards the Russians.
Oh yeah, that. Well, let's see, how do we start this? Do you want me to start, we gotta maybe talk about the bunker buster bombing of Luxembourg.
What?
Yeah, he got into a Twitter fit with the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, and so rather quickly he launched a nuclear missile at them, and after that was done, we ended up basically going to war with Russia, Iran, Luxembourg, and Malta.
Okay. How are things with the Veterans Administration?
Oh, we don't have that anymore. Instead, Trump has just decided to literally give them all gift certificates to CVS.
Oh dear. Next up, we have Jeffrey St. Clair. He is the editor of Counterpunch, one of the most outstanding left-wing magazines and internet websites today, and he is talking with me about his fantastically funny book, Bernie and the Sandernistas, which I highly recommend all of you pick up. Seeing what the outcome was in the election, are you having any moments where you wonder or think differently about what you wrote and said over the course of the campaign?
Trump's ascendancy? No.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I think they're all who we thought they were. I had no illusions about Trump, certainly none about Hillary. And I think Sanders is, proving, every day that he's acting like a good soldier for the Democrats. The real question is, why? I mean, why is Bernie Sanders, after all of this, still a willing combatant for the senator from Citibank?
Right.
Why does he agree to serve in the leadership for, the neoliberal cabal that still runs the Democratic Party?
Mm-hmm.
That's really one of the big mysteries, I think.
I was reading an essay by Frederick Jameson from 2007, and he says that the fight for the welfare state is a worthwhile battle precisely because losing it is that moment that can radicalize people towards a better liberation politics. And
well,
I think
is there more?
Well, I think that it's clear that Sanders' campaign was not what he expected, and it might have taken on dimensions he never expected it to take on.
Well, you say the Sanders campaign. I think that if I made one sort of, diagnosis, maybe it was in sort of early on deprecating the Sandernistas, this movement that coalesced around Sanders. It wasn't, his campaign was, I think, inept. The movement was there, and the movement far preceded Sanders, and in ways had its origins all the way back in 1999 with the uprising in Seattle, the campaigns against globalization and international finance institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, certainly the Nader campaigns, and then the Occupy movement. So that was there. And to associate that movement in a substantial way as Sanders, as if he was, Prospero, sort of conjuring it out of the midst of the sea, is just flat out wrong. And but it's also a sign of hope. In other words, that this movement has been around for a long time, and it's going to be around after Sanders. And his little corporations like Our Revolution are not going to be able to control it or have much influence over it, particularly as long as they remain allied with the Democratic Party. Now, as for Jameson, that's sort of the old Maoist line, right, of heightening the contradiction. And I think, Alex and I, Alexander Coburn I'm talking about, sort of flirted with that. We were sort of, we talked about chaos politics and the like, but it was always with a kind of sober view that, The people on the margins are going to go through, a lot of shit when the welfare state is finally abolished. And there's going to be a lot of pain and suffering, and it's sort of easy for Frederick Jameson, to sit in his leather jacket. I don't know if he's still riding his motorcycle or not, and make these pronouncements, because he's not going to be feeling any of that. And the idea that that's going to spark a revolution in this country, of all countries, which really has very few traditions of those kinds of mass uprising, I think is almost to traffic in a kind of delusion.
Okay. So what was your own feeling going into the campaign in terms of what you expected from Sanders, and did you see him stay to those predictions, or do you think he went outside of even those margins at any point?
I had very few expectations for Sanders because, I've been following his career, for 20 years, I guess, and Coburn had followed it longer because he knew him when he was mayor of Burlington. One of the very first articles in Counterpunch for our online edition was chronicling the Sanders had just been elected to the Congress as representative, an independent socialist from Vermont, and one of his very first major votes was to back Bill Clinton's war on the independent socialist country of Serbia, which ignited a rebellion amongst his own staff, where you had, some really, good progressives like Jeremy Brecher, resigning in protest.
Right.
And I think that really was who Sanders was at the time and who he remains. I mean, so again, you see, even when he's in the Senate, some years later, Bill Clinton, wants to essentially wage a covert war to topple Saddam in Iraq, a really heinous war driven by almost a genocidal sanction regime, which targeted civilians, restricting food, medicine, the necessities of daily life, that ended up killing over 500,000 children, which also financed covert operations to try and topple Saddam. Sanders voted for that 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, when Bush was in office, he kind of grandstanded with his votes against the war that he had only, a couple of years before fully supported. So he's a hypocrite, and I think he remained a hypocrite through the campaign. He's kind of cowardly also, I thought. I know at the beginning of the campaign, with all of the reservations I had about Sanders, I described myself as the founding member of a whore, anybody but Hillary. And in that sense was willing to back anyone, from the left, from the anti-war libertarian movement, wherever, who was going to launch a frontal assault against her campaign. And from the get-go, it was clear that Sanders was either incapable or unwilling of waging that kind of campaign. You remember, well, the first debate where he made this chivalrous gesture of interrupting a question. I think it was CNN was hosting that debate, basically preempting the issue of her emails, saying, enough with the damn emails. And I just remember this grin on Hillary's face at the time. So, it was like the recognition that this guy is not going to be any kind of threat to me. I don't even need my super delegates. I don't need whatever Debbie Wasserman Schultz is cooking up at the DNC. I don't need it because this guy is incapable of hitting me on the pressure points, which could stop my juggernaut. So it was a huge wasted opportunity. He refused to. I don't think in any one of his interminable speeches he ever once mentioned the word neoliberalism. And even if he didn't mention it because it's confusing to many people, he didn't describe the political philosophy of neoliberalism and how it had, largely with under the Clintons' corporate sponsorship, taken the Democratic Party into a death embrace. And if he wasn't willing to do that, if that wasn't the look, he had to know he was not going to win. The superdelegates alone were so stacked in her advantage, there was no chance that Sanders was ever going to win. So why run then if you're not willing to wage total war on, the forces of neoliberalism, which have the party under occupation?
Right.
Ultimately, I think it became an ego thing for him. He won some primaries, he won some caucuses, and he was like, began tripping on the fumes of his own rhetoric. And I think that's in a way, a great betrayal of the movement that he had magnetized, I guess. He brought all of these, several of these disparate grassroots movements. He had attracted them to his campaign, and he had them, and he did nothing with them except deliver them, to the Clinton campaign in the end.
Right. So you describe Trump, by contrast, as something out of a Burroughs novel in your book. Could you briefly elaborate on your own reaction to how that rolled out? Because it was very obvious at one point Trump was quite literally just stealing lines from Sanders in his speeches.
Trump is he's just he's like I compare him to Burroughs in the fact that he's a junkie, driven by his own narcissism. He just feeds on his his self-love, I guess. And he's absolutely shameless. He's someone who will say anything. He will, easily plagiarize, Sanders, 1 minute, and Evola or Mussolini the next. He's absolutely shameless in that regard, and he's staying true to his lack of character, I guess. But that was an easy. I wouldn't even call it a niche, since it's almost like a Grand Canyon, the sort of void that's been left for politicians who could speak directly to the white working class, which has been pulverized by the globalized economy, by neoliberalism, by essentially the paternalistic nature of the Democratic Party, which for decades had pretended to represent the interest of working class people. So it was easy for Trump to feed and feed upon that resentment. There was no one who was really going to challenge him, in his own party. And, Hillary was inevitably going to be his opponent. And, she didn't even try to speak to these people. So Schumer summed it up when he said, look, we don't need these blue-collar voters because, we're going to get all of the Republican suburban women in the suburbs of Philadelphia and places like that. Absolutely upfront about their intentions. And, look, people are not stupid. They did not need, the senator from Citibank to utter those words. They knew it, because they felt it for decades.
Right. So touching on kind of the inverse of what you talked about, these movements magnetizing towards Sanders, it seemed to me at one point that Trump very obviously was at least also borrowing some of the energy and attracting some of the followers from Ron Paul's 2012 campaign. And the only difference really between him and Ron Paul was he was much less ashamed of the elements in the Ron Paul base that can be quite publicly reactionary. And I was wondering what your reaction was to that thought.
Who are we talking about here, Trump or Sanders?
Trump's base.
Trump. Well, yeah, obviously, he did, appeal to a lot of the Ron Paul people. I think libertarians were more, obviously much more suspicious of Trump. Ron Paul, I don't think, is a libertarian. There are things I like about, Ron Paul. You just have to, he was, one of two or three people in the Congress who could be counted on, to vote against military intervention and, the domestic surveillance state. And on the other hand, there was a really reactionary element to Paul, which you don't find in a lot of, the small L libertarians. And Trump was able to seize on that kind of, I guess you would call it the hard right. I don't know if there's paleo right. I'm not sure that quite fits, but sure. So there was, but I think that the non-intervention aspect, Trump's constantly bringing up, and really the only one with any credibility who could attack Hillary on her Iraq war votes. Because Sanders was completely compromised. Sanders was compromised on Libya. Sanders was compromised on Syria. So he could not he could not legitimately raise those issues, and he really didn't even try. Sort of half-hearted and limp on those questions. And Trump wasn't. So he was able to. He was able to attract that kind of the right-wing anti-interventionist crowd that it coalesced around Paul, and that kind of energy too. I think if you'd ever gone to any of Ron Paul's campaign events in the two previous years in the primaries, those were really raucous crowds. A lot like. I only saw Trump, which was in Eugene, but it had that sort of frenzy of a Ron Paul event. Even though I find Trump a really he has no rhetorical gifts as far as I could tell.
Yeah.
But the crowds were really. They were ready to go, that's for sure. And you got that kind of I mean, there's an erotic charge to it, and a slightly fanatic charge too. You know, there was this energetic enthusiasm, and there was also an edge of violence to it.
Yes.
There was a real bloodlust, which you didn't get from the Sanders events, even though they were big and, you know, they were more like political raves or something. You know, everybody was grooving to their granddaddy. But it didn't have the feel of a revolution. You know, there was not a revolutionary, you know, fervor to them the way there was to Trump events.
Right.
You know, I mean, people left those events, you know, wanting to go beat the crap out of somebody.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's not the kind of vibe that people had after they left a Sanders event. It was like they're on ecstasy or something.
Right. I mean, in my own case, I quite literally was having a conversation with somebody about the whole lesser evil dynamic about Clinton or Jill Stein. And then I went over to a libertarian Facebook where they were having Trump or Gary Johnson.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, I mean, I know Gary Johnson, and I like him, but he was just not the lesser evil alternative, you know, to Trump on that side. You know, he was just the contrast in what they offered and their personalities was just too jarring, I think.
Yeah,
I don't know. It was like you know, Megadeth versus James Taylor or something. You know, just the dissonance was too profound.
and in all honesty, this is one of the funnier political books I've read in a long time. Did you get any personal joy out of writing these things, or was there kind of like a resignation to it, or how did you feel just as the author of this stuff?
I think that, you know, this election was one where everybody had to be ridiculed. was basically my feeling that it just the surreality of it all, the pathetic nature of the choices that we'd been presented had finally come to this: Trump versus Clinton, and with Sanders, you know, stalking around like Banquo's ghost or something. I don't know. It just seems so totally absurd to me. And I just thought, you know, sort of, I know the book's, you know, really sarcastic, I think, through most of it, and that can probably wear on the reader after a while, but it certainly represented, you know, how I felt about the campaigns and the election.
Are there any other points you'd like to bring up in closing, particularly because of recent developments in the news in terms of climate change? I think that has been left out of the discourse and really needs to be.
Well, you know, obviously, I guess Trump signed today his first, you know, continuing resolution, which was to end transparency in oil and gas regulations, which lets you know what we've come to. You know, I mean, they're just blatant. We're going to hide the shit from you and proceed apace. I think, to be frank, I think ultimately Trump's, you know, climate policies are going to be, in reality, about the same as Obama and Clinton. But what you're not going to get is any false rhetoric about it. So, in that sense, it's probably going to be much easier to construct a resistance to what Trump's doing. Of course, nobody on the left wanted to resist Obama on anything. And in that sense, and in a way, Jameson is right superficially that there's going to be resistance to Trump where there wasn't any resistance to Obama, and there wouldn't have been resistance to Hillary on these policies. So, I think back to Reagan time, when you had really 12 years of a very hostile administration toward the environment, and they were almost brought to a standstill by the environmental movement. They had grand plans for despoliation of the West and the waters of the country and the air of the continent, and were largely brought to a standstill because there was massive resistance to what we were doing. And that resistance evaporated the very moment that Clinton and Gore became, their administration took power, and they were able to implement, a lot of the policies that Reagan and the first Bush were fought back, upon. So let's hope that the resistance can, get up off its back and fight Trump, who is not hiding any of his agenda, really. Other than that, but basically I'm very pessimistic.
Right.
That anything meaningful is going to be done on climate change, or any other issue. We're in a period of trench warfare, really, like you're seeing, in Standing Rock, like you'll be seeing, in sanctuary cities and on the borders, and probably, in the forest of the Pacific Northwest as they gear up to start clear cutting them again. And
and it's becoming
bleak. It's bleak. There's no silver lining to Trump. You can look for the silver lining is one would have hoped would have been the absolute repudiation of Clintonism. But we haven't seen that from the Democratic Party, as its leadership continues to be the old guard of Pelosi and Schumer and their acolytes, who have now sort of brought Sanders into the fold.
And now they're
that's really one of the most distressing parts of this whole thing, is that you lose an election that you had absolutely no business losing, and you learn absolutely nothing from it. What Adam Schiff, the Democratic congressman from California, said the other day, that one of the worst side effects of Trump's election was that it was radicalizing the Democratic Party base. They were going to be more difficult to control. Now, would that it were so. I remember one of the more amusing WikiLeaks documents from Podesta's email server being an exchange between Jake Sullivan, who was a longtime Clinton staffer, and Neera Tanden of the Center for American Progress, one of the big deep thinkers of the Democratic Party, where Sullivan wrote her an email saying, I'm really fearful that the Red Army faction is beginning to influence Hillary. And Tanden writes back with a little smiley face on her email saying, by Red Army faction, you're talking about the Democratic base, aren't you? And the issue that so concerned them was whether or not Hillary would come out and support the $15 an hour minimum wage movement, which they apparently believed was, some sort of communist plot.
Right. And now we're seeing whispers of Mayor Clinton for New York City.
Mayor Clinton, yes.
So apparently the gift that keeps on giving.
It's the gift that keeps on giving. Yeah. frankly, I think, is Obama's greatest failing, and that he has many failings, but that he didn't clean out the DNC of the Clintonian neoliberals after his election.
Right.
And so they're still there. The money's still coming from the same places. And, the third way Democratic Party policies still rule. And they undermined him. Apparently, he just didn't care because they undermined him at every step. Because these people really wanted Hillary to run against him in 2012. And they were working against him from the inside from day one. And, he really did nothing to clean them out. And the country's paying the price, 8 years later for that.
And now we're going to have a short conversation with Dr. John Geyman, who is going to talk about why national health insurance is absolutely necessary in the face of both the collapse of the ACA that was caused earlier this summer before a single vote was cast, and the Republican intention to quote-unquote repeal and replace Obamacare. So, Dr. Geyman, starting off, let's talk about where things have been developing since the summertime and the debacle of the Aetna-Humana merger, which was causing essentially a collapse in the exchange system before Election Day. And what are your thoughts on how that has developed in the past several months?
Well, it's not a surprise. The Justice Department has been looking at the downsides of consolidation. That's what is it? It's chapter 2 in my new book. No, it's chapter 1 actually in my new book. And I look at the whole history of consolidation and back before the two mergers went down, it would have been just 3 big insurers. So now we've got 5 giant insurers before those 2 mergers were not approved. So I don't think it changes everything mightily, except to exhibit the problem that regulators realize about too much consolidation. So, and that's in that chapter, and I have the number of millions of people that would be covered if we went down to 3. It's just huge. It's most of the marketplace.
And just from a general observer's point of view, does it bear any similarity to your mind in comparison to other previous industrial monopoly issues or trusts, such as perhaps AT&T 30-odd years ago or so?
Sure, I think so. I'm not expert in other industries, but sure, I think so. And the justice people, I think so too. But in healthcare, the myth is that the myth is that there's competition in the healthcare system, and that is a myth because there isn't. The healthcare system doesn't work like other parts of the economy, and that's been well known for years.
Where do you think things are going to begin to move over the course of the next year to 18 months as the Congress begins to confront the ACA and repeal issues?
Well, I frankly think the GOP is digging its hole deeper every day. They on the far right, they wanted to repeal yesterday and last year, like 60 times or something like that. and now they have the chance, but the far right, the Freedom Caucus, wants to repeal the heck out of it without any replacement plan, and there is no real replacement plan. What we hear leaked, and they can't even find the document in the basement of somewhere in Congress. They're afraid to come out with it, but we know most of what's going to be in it, namely use more health savings accounts, sell insurance across state lines, decrease regulation on the insurers, but you can't whack 20 million people off their health care coverage by some quick stroke. And there's part of the dilemma for the Republicans if they repeal the individual mandate right off and repeal and set back the Medicaid expansion right off. And a lot of governors and even Republican governors want to not face the fury of people that go off Medicaid. And then, of course, block grants to states, that'll be part of it. And so none of the high-risk pools, none of this has worked. High-risk pools, as I've shown in my new book, haven't worked at all. They get adverse selection, and they're unaffordable, as you would expect. Selling across state lines doesn't work. Insurers just game the system. They go to the most lenient states and set up shop. The insurance lobby is very strong in all the state capitals, and quote, regulation of premiums is weak. So insurers will gain by whatever the Republicans do in trying to replace the ACA. But the ACA, I think the Republicans are right in that there's no cost containment in it, and it is gradually imploding. Bottom line, your question, next year and a half, I think is going to get worse before it gets better. And the only way to get this whole thing better is to recognize, as my blog just said, that we can save money, we can give universal access to real care for every 320 million people in the country with a much more efficient, not-for-profit financing system, coupled with a private delivery system, with full choice of doc and hospital anywhere in the country, like civilized countries do. And the latest study on that, of what we can save, is that we'll save $616 billion a year as soon as we do enact single-payer national health insurance. So, no, it's just going to get worse. I don't expect the Republicans to figure it out. And on the other side, those defending the ACA are defending a system that won't work indefinitely. So I think we can do much better with our taxpayer money than either the ACA or whatever the Republicans would try and replace it with. So repeal and repair is one of their slogans right now. Like keep the ACA's can't deny on the basis of pre-existing conditions, and keep the ability to keep your kids on your parents' policies till they're 26. But they're going to find it's, as Trump just said, this is really complicated, So, I'm not optimistic on what's going to happen until we have a groundswell of support for real reform, which is single payer.
What were your reactions or impressions of the Trump State of the Union address this past week? And I mean, a lot of that speech was essentially just sloganeering, but what jumped out at you as tenable?
Just there's nothing tenable about his views on healthcare, or I think on most everything else he says. They're very empty rhetoric, lots of lies. His promises about healthcare are just absurd. The Republicans, the sloganeering about this access to instead of actual care is if you look at it on its face, it's absurd too. So, just full of empty promises. He has no idea what he's doing. There's no there.
Right. So, what do you think states can or should do on their own local legislative level to prevent some of the abuses, where it would be creating consumer standards if things are allowed to cross state lines, mandating that whoever comes into their state is held to certain things, or be it even trying to create single payer on a state level? What do you think is possible?
Well, that's been looked at hard. Have you followed Don McCann's quote of the day? Don McCann is a colleague and friend, and he's a retired family physician in Orange County, California. And he's been president, as I have, of Physicians for a National Health Program back in the early 2000s. And for the last something like 14 or 15 years, he's done a quote of the day 5 days a week. He researches widely the health policy literature, the reports from government, reports from other countries, all kinds of sources. And his email, and you can get on his quote of the day thing. It's Don at McCann.org. Don at all lowercase DONMCCANNE.org. Don at McCann.org. But that's an ongoing graduate course in health policy. Mm-hmm. And he deals with all these issues, including the questions you're asking now. And he bases his quotes on real evidence, and so that would be a real resource if you're not there. So
certainly.
But so back to the last question, which was what again?
What can be done on the state
Okay.
legislative?
Well, Don has done a piece back there a couple years ago on the challenges of states going to single payer on their own. And it hasn't happened yet, but not for lack of trying. Vermont looked like it might be the first state to do so. The governor backed out a couple of years ago. But there's a backstory to that, too. Out in Hawaii, they've had support for such. It hasn't happened. In California, they actually had a bill for such, and it was vetoed by Schwarzenegger. There's a groundswell in California right now towards the same, and Governor Jerry Brown possibly could sign it. But as Don has pointed out, and I do in my book too, there are a lot of problems in doing what Canada did. Canada, with their single-payer system, as you know, it started in Saskatchewan. Tommy Douglas is the hero of Medicare for All up there. And it started around hospital costs in Saskatchewan province, and then spread over a couple, 3 years across the whole country. But here we have so many sources of healthcare funding within the Beltway, ranging from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, to Indian Health Service, to the VA, to the whatever else, and on, and agencies that don't talk to each other very much or aren't used to getting rid of all their funds and sending them into a state for a single pool. So that in itself has rendered any effort so far futile. So I actually think it's going to take federal legislation like H.R. 676, the Conyers bill, to really pull it off in this country. But Don's got a whole piece on that back there, buddy.
Are there any points that you think are worth discussing about the notion of HSAs and state lines that you haven't previously spoken about? Why those are problematic solutions?
No, it's all updated in my new book,
right?
Which is, and I'll be glad to send you a copy of that if you like. I'll need your address. And
certainly.
But it's all updated with references up into early February, just right now. But it turns out, as you probably know, a lot of people don't have enough discretionary money to put into a health savings account. A lot of people, even if they have them, they don't invest in it. The main thing is, no matter how much money in this system we've got, if you get a big accident or get quite sick, how are you going to cover $100,000 a year in a cancer drug that you can't afford? On and on. So it's a false premise to think you can save enough to cover your health care costs. The average family of four now spends $25K plus on insurance, deductibles, and actual care a year. And the median income of the U.S. is $53K. So, and then the other main, as the Commonwealth Foundation has studied well, and that's in my books, the other essential costs are obviously food and housing and a car to go to work and a couple other things, and health care. How does $25K fit with an income not much more than twice? It just doesn't. So the mass of people who can't afford health care now, or even insurance with these high deductibles, which have gotten as high now as $10K, is just an imploding system. And we still tolerate the corporate interests, especially the insurance industry and the drug industry, calling the shots.
Right. I was wondering if you could clarify, is there a difference between the public option and total nationalized healthcare system in terms of system that would perhaps, say, eliminate all insurance companies altogether?
Well, the public option, as it was framed up and then killed in the ACA, it would have been pretty weak compared to the power and market share of the private insurance industry, 1,300 some insurers, especially given all the bonuses that the ACA gave them, all kinds of ways of gaming the system, like we, the feds, will help you out if you find you're losing money, and there was that risk corridor system, et cetera, et cetera. But the insurers have so many ways to game the system and somehow select out the healthier and avoid the sicker and dump the sicker on traditional Medicare or Medicaid. So I don't think the public option is really viable. Intuitively, it might seem attractive, but I don't think it'll work. And we're not talking about a nationalized healthcare system. We're not talking about socialized medicine when we talk about single-payer financing. We are talking about the capacity to negotiate the prices of drugs, as the VA has done forever. That'll reduce drug costs. We are talking about negotiated budgets for hospitals that will allow them to stay in business and realize a little bit of gain. But we are talking about real cost containment. But docs will be in private practice. I think we can see a return to small group practice. Right now, we've had hospital systems getting bigger and bigger, and some 64% of all docs in the country are employees of these hospital systems, or sometimes even by insurance companies. So docs have lost all kinds of autonomy, and there's increasing burnout among physicians. So it'll be a private delivery system, but with public financing, a lot more efficient than we have now. So, but the opponents of single payer always call it a takeover of medicine by the government, but that's not correct.
Right. One of the issues that was prominent and very interesting to see was the issue of cooperatives in the ACA. I was wondering if you think that things will change for co-ops because of...
No.
Okay.
No, I don't think so. I mean, most of them folded, and those that are still alive are not in good shape. No.
Okay.
No, it's attractive for many to think about how can we tweak and improve the ACA around the edges, but it's fundamentally flawed. I mean, it just hands over to private insurers without enough regulation, huge markets, and subsidizes those with taxpayer subsidies. What the Republicans are talking about are tax credits, but it ends up kind of the same deal. And it assumes that the system should be for profit, and Wall Street loves it. The insurance industry has thrived under the ACA. So has the drug industry. I mean, we have to ask who the system is for, which I bring up quite regularly. Is it for the big corporations, or is it for all us people in the country, 320 million? Are we going to have a reliable system that's there, or are we not? And that's another part of we haven't talked about yet, but both I think the plans that are being talked about by the Republicans to replace, they both want, Paul Ryan and his other people want to further privatize Medicare and further privatize Medicaid. And that's chapter 2 in my new book. We have a long record now of privatized Medicare. It just games the system, and sicker people end up moving back to traditional Medicare. It's much less efficient. The overhead's much higher. And the same with privatized Medicaid, which has flourished in a lot of these states. But the same pattern. It costs more, the benefits are less reliable, etc. So, no.
Okay. Are there any points in closing you would like to bring up?
I think we should be able to learn from other countries. We keep thinking in terms we're exceptional. We're not that exceptional. In healthcare, we're exceptionally expensive and exceptionally poor access compared to other developed countries. So we just don't learn. And I think that's stupid.
Right.
This is a huge part of our GDP. Is getting bigger all the time, and we're not going to be able to afford it.
That's all we got for the time for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time for another episode of Political Gingervitis. I'm your host, Andrew Stewart, and I want to remind you again, America's greatest social democratic period corresponded with the lives of those wonderful commies, Larry, Curly, and Moe.